Why does Elie Jacobs need to meet Eric Markowitz? Why do we need geopolitical brand consulting strategists to meet our favorite investigative journalists turned hedge fund analysts? Roll the clips, Jack.
There's a lost art of having fun in business. How do you embed fun in the workplace? Not in a cheesy, hey, let's all go bowling with the team this Friday, but maybe that is the right way to do it.
Brand is what you say you do. Reputation is what everybody else says you do. And the bigger distance between those two things, that's what we call your risk aperture.
It's more important if you actually want to have good ideas to do the work that doesn't scale and that's inefficient and slow. The Latin root of patience is suffering. I think we're like all optimized for speed and doing things like getting instant gratification. I think a lot about where does value accrue over the longest. The work that doesn't scale may actually be the most valuable stuff. And
that's the wandering part. We red team everything. We look at everything from the way a journalist or a regulator or a stakeholder is going to look at it. Credible and fact are not necessarily the exact same thing, but they're a lot closer related than bullshit and truth.
And now I can't wait for you to meet them too. New Just Press Record out now. You're watching Just Press Record right here on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. We're introducing two fascinating people for the first time ever to each other, to probably a lot of you, and certainly to the rest of our network. So let's get right into this. This first guest, he nicked the invest part straight out of investigative journalism, going from magazine cover stories to hedge fund analyst deep dives. And he's such a big thinker. They wanted to remove an extra growth from inside of his head. Take that, you second brain people, which I know I'm making a probably insensitive joke out of now, but I kind of feel like this guest is cheating. And there's something going on there because his brain has so much great stuff in it already. It didn't know where to put some. And last but not least, he's not built to spill, but there's a reason the Shiksas call him a tall glass of Manischewitz. Big think author, Night View Capital Director of Research. It's Eric Markowitz. Eric Markowitz, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. What a wind up.
I gotta tee up for this next guest because guest number two, if I was doing the branding for a new solo venture for this guy, I'd probably be calling it, I don't know, Jacob's Marketing Ladder, something like that. Because what do you do when the proverbial stuff hits the fan? When you're in crisis, when you're deep in crisis, and you really just want to go take a nap and to walk back and forth between Earth and the skies above to get some good ideas for how to position your life or reposition it in the context of the world when you wake back up because it feels like a nightmare. This is the guy who does that type of work every single day, and you'll likely never get to hear about it. So we're not talking basics like books getting rebranded as ebooks, but we're not talking unhealthy like cigarettes getting rebranded as e-cigarettes, or fancy almost healthy but environmentally weird like bikes getting rebranded as e-bikes. And is that real? Isn't that cheating? Aren't they just motorcycles with battery packs? We're talking about the temperature of the world around you, how you take it, never telling e-lies. This guest is 100% the e-truth, purposeful advisor, founder, public affairs and crisis communicator extraordinaire. I can't promise we won't be asking him to fix our lives, but in this episode, Elie Jacobs, welcome to the show. Say hello, Elie.
Wow. I need you as my hype man everywhere.
Okay. Hired. I accept the job. Now, we're going to have both of you guess why I needed to pair you together. By the end of this episode, you at home, take your notes. You can guess too. We're going to all play this game, but this is where I want to start. I want to start with Elie because this is something I've heard you talk about. I've read you talk about. I just think it's so obvious and so useful. What's the difference as you describe it between brand and reputation? I love this idea.
It's real simple. And I try to do everything as simple as possible because it's the only way that I can understand it. I don't have the big brain that Eric has. Brand is what you say you do. Reputation is what everybody else says you do. And the bigger distance between those two things, that's what we call your risk aperture. The greater the expanse of what people are expecting from you and what you're actually doing, that's where risk really fits into your life. So if you're saying you're doing something, you better sure as hell do it. And if people don't think you're doing it, you better figure out why they don't think you're doing it.
Eric, you've written about all sorts of stuff in the past. Do you distinguish in your brain between brand and reputation? Is this a new concept for you, or do you have different words on this thing?
I don't know about the language of it, but I will go back to the brain thing just to clarify a point, which I think Elie might like. There's a Yiddish expression, Loch and Kopf. Maybe you've heard your grandparents say this, like, I need this like I need a hole in my head. I technically have a hole in my head. So Matt's referring to the fact that something was removed from my brain. So though you say I have a bigger brain, I actually have a smaller brain, volumetrically, mass-wise. As far as the distinction between Brandon, it's a great question. I think both are, the only way I think about this question is maybe both are becoming increasingly important, especially on reputation. I think as the world gets more complex, chaotic, and, especially in the last couple of years, just the explosion of AI and deepfakes, we just don't know what's real. Authenticity and reputation will increase in value. So I think that there's some interesting nuances of the difference between brand and reputation. I don't really have a handle maybe as well as Elie would, but I think it's a rich vein to kind of keep going down.
Well, let's talk about this for a second then. So Elie, like when somebody encounters these words and as you frame them for the first time, what do you do to help them understand? Like, give us an example, give us a story, give us something to ground these words a little more.
So the easiest way to think about it, I'm coming out of politics. I frame things a lot in kind of political language also because people are more familiar with kind of that vibe than they are sort of with corporate speak, I think, because, just reading the news, watching the news, or God help us, West Wing, like people are just sort of in that vein a little bit more. When, let's say you're going out on a date, right? You've been presented as something to somebody. That's in theory, your reputation, right? You don't know necessarily that either your Hinge profile or whatever kids do nowadays. I've been married and with my wife for a very long time, so I don't know anything from internet dating. What you're presenting is your brand, but you don't know how people are interpreting, right? So you could end up on a date where you think that this person has one impression of you, but he, or whoever it is, has a completely different impression of who or what you are, or what you've done in your life, or kind of the way that you think. I remember I went on this predates my wife's by a while. I went on a date with somebody and we went back to her apartment afterwards, not for nefarious reasons, because she needed her roommate to eyeball me to make sure I wasn't this other Elie Jacobs. So again, that's brand and reputation, right? Like there was this other Elie Jacobs out there who, incidentally, I've met one of them. There are like at least 2 or 3 others that I know of, who had this reputation. I don't know the details of it, but I went back to this woman's apartment so that her roommate could eyeball me to make sure I wasn't that. Fast forward, I don't know, almost 20 years, somebody moved into my building recently, and on, kind of a group WhatsApp of all the Jews in the building, she asked if I was that other Elie Jacobs. So again, there's reputation and brand. What are you putting out there, and what are people interpreting it as?
Take me back to investigative journalism, Eric days. This whole thing about this distinction between who you are, who a company is, who an executive is, who somebody you would be writing about, who they are, politician or not, and just how reputation sometimes like chases away. You've seen a lot of this stuff in real time, Eric, and you've written about it quite deeply.
Yeah. I think that ultimately, I mean, if you're asking like what is the role of a good investigative reporter, really just journalist, is trying to understand the delta between what is presented and what is the reality. So there's a lot of money, just capital, time invested in creating brands around companies. They have entire departments called marketing and public relations and communications. And these fields are really created to tell a story about a certain company or person. And sometimes those stories are fairly accurate. And I think, in my experience as a journalist, I would write about companies and I'd spend time with the leaders and I'd say, well, actually what they're saying, there's a fair degree of credibility to it. I think where, the problem obviously is when that delta between the truth and the brand gets wider and wider and wider. And you see this with a lot of companies. I mean, the outright terrible examples would be fraud, something like a Theranos, which is they told a story about what they could do, their core competency, their technology. The reality was very far from that. So they created a brand, but ultimately the reputation was completely damaged because the story was so incorrect. I actually think it's an interesting case because had they just told a slightly different story, they may still be around. I think because a lot of these nuances are really important to grapple with. If they had just said, hey, look, it's not there yet. The technology is not perfect. We're still working on it. That might have actually expanded the runway and given them more credibility to keep working. They didn't do that. They went too extreme in the we've solved this problem. And I don't really follow it, but I think one of them went to jail. They both went to jail. They've certainly been fined and gotten in a lot of trouble. So I think like as a reporter, you would see this constantly, which is they tell you a story and then your job is to basically go say, okay, is this story accurate? And if not, what is the truth? Of course, as a reporter, you're just one person. You can't really kind of distill everything down to the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality. But ultimately, that's, I think, what you strive for is just the objective reality of a situation, which is often in contradiction or in combat with many millions and in some cases billions of dollars that are trying to push you to believe a certain thing about a brand or a person.
Yeah. I mean, when we reach out to journalists, I always start with the mindset that if it's a journalist I'm reaching out to, I respect them, right? Because there are shoddy journalists out there. It just exists just like there are shoddy people doing anything. But I usually look at a journalist's job is to be a truth seeker, right? My job is not necessarily to be a truth teller to the journalist. My job is to be a truth teller to my client. But where I work with a journalist is not, I'm not putting lipstick on a pig. That's just not the kind of work that I do. But it is to Eric's point, it is to change the perception of what we're doing, right? So like Theranos is a great example. And Eric's right. I think that they would have probably been still in business and she wouldn't be in jail. And I think her appeal just got rejected again today or yesterday. I saw in the newspaper. Elizabeth Holmes, right? That's her name?
Yeah.
Yeah. They would probably still be in business had they not decided that, oh no, we're just going to go with saying this thing works, right? Like, and that's a place where a lot of startups can get in trouble when they race their brand in front of their reputation. So one of the things that we try to do is we red team everything. We look at everything from the way a journalist or a regulator or a stakeholder is going to look at it. And we break down your story that you think you have to make it as credible as possible. Credible and fact are not necessarily the exact same thing, but they're a lot closer related than bullshit and truth. Define
red team, like say that.
Red team, sure. So it's a term out of the military and out of the intelligence community. Mika Zelenko wrote a book on it a couple of years ago. It's a terrific book called Red Team. It's basically devil's advocate. Your job is to knock down the other side. You're looking at all the holes. You're trying to find the problem. You're the jerk. And my business partner, Frank DeMaria, and we are often the jerks with clients to the point that we've been shouted out of initial meetings. Things have gotten really difficult. It's just the reality of the way that things work. We need to do that so that we feel comfortable going out and talking to people like Eric and other journalists, because if we don't believe that your story is credible or that you can back up what you're saying you're doing, we can't go out there because that becomes our credibility to go to the journalists that we have relationships with or journalists that we don't have relationships with. If we're just, out there, and there are plenty of firms that do this, if we're just out there kind of pushing bullshit, that's a temporary relationship, both with the journalist and the client. We're not doing anybody any good by perpetuating fraud, lies, deception, purposeful deception, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I think when I think about this question just across business generally, it's not just relationships, obviously, with between a company and journalists. It's really with, I think, probably more importantly, is with their customers. So if you're telling a customer a certain story, and ultimately, the product doesn't work as intended or the service isn't as good as what the customer thought it was, then that creates friction in the relationship, and ultimately it harms the relationship, and it creates a lot of fragility within the business because disappointed customers won't come back. And I think most business models are best when they're not transactional and that you have repeat customers. So I was a journalist, Elie. I'm now an investor for the last 10 years. And so apply a lot of investigative journalism and reporting techniques to thinking about companies.
Yeah.
And one of the kind of filters that I like to use when looking at a company is just very simply, how do they treat their customers? And it's not on an ethical level so much as it is on a business level. How durable is this customer? Which means really how recurring are the revenues, which also means how much risk is embedded in the business model. And so you can de-risk a business by just having better relationships with your customers. And as Matt knows, I'm working on this kind of longer term project around looking at some of the world's oldest and most resilient businesses. And what keeps coming up is just this idea that they have really good relationships with customers. It sounds very obvious, sounds very simple, but I think like increasingly in modern context where there's an ever-ending quest for growth and just moving quickly, a lot of these relationships with customers get compromised because you're always looking for the next customer, not necessarily looking on the current customer. So I think like it's a subtle reframing, and companies that do this really well think about how can I really just elevate the experience for our customer, I think will succeed. And just to give one live kind of tangible example, we've owned Amazon for a long time, and I'm doing a lot of research right now looking at their fulfillment centers and basically their same day operation, how they actually get you stuff after clicking buy and it arrives at your house an hour later. So I just have been fascinated by this question and talking with a lot of their AI team, robotics team. And what keeps coming up fascinatingly to me is it's not just technology. It's that when the technology breaks, they actually flag it in the system and then spend a lot more money in terms of, time, resources, capital to get you that item faster. So if that means they lose money on, overnighting something because they realize they screwed up, they'll do it. So most of the transactions don't end up that way. They end up making money on most. But where they realize that there's going to be a disconnect between customer expectation and what the reality is, they're willing to basically lose on the deal just to make you happy, which is a very subtle point, but part of the reason why, we like the company. I think it's why it's going to continue to do quite well and why it's perhaps somewhat resilient, because this focus on like making the customer happy, which is a bit of a lost art, I'd say.
I think so. A client of mine years ago, this goes back well over a decade, was American Express customer service department, right? American Express is well known for their customer service. And one of the things that we would do every year is kind of do an audit of other companies that are recognized as having good customer service. So that was Apple, Amazon, Cafe Pacific, Singapore Air, a handful of companies that are just recognized as being customer centric. And there's real brand loyalty to that. I mean, one of the reasons I'm, brand loyal to Nike isn't just because I like Nike sneakers and I grew up in the era of Michael Jordan and like all that. It's one time a pair of sneakers fell apart and they sent me a new pair, right? Like it becomes, not to get too wildly philosophical about it, but there's a Jewish German philosopher named Martin Buber. He wrote a book called I Thou, right? I think it's somewhere on my shelf behind me. But he creates this dichotomy of I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. I-it relationships are transactional, right? You get in a cab driver drops you off somewhere, you're done. I-thou relationships are actually relationships, right? So maybe you have a driver and drives you every day. Or, your I-it relationship is Walmart, your I-thou relationship is Amazon. And I think it is really a lost art. I think, I think the introduction of AI is sort of the stopgap between the customer and the company. And now you don't even have that middle person on the phone with you. That's going to introduce a whole nother level that I think is really going to be traumatic for people to completely lose the humanity totally.
When you're looking at some of these longer term companies, Eric, and this new work that I know you're at the beginning of this project, but do you see that just coming up over and over again, like what Elie just said?
Repeatedly. Yeah.
Did you expect to see it coming up as much as you're seeing it coming up?
I think that some of these things are somewhat obvious in hindsight. So the project, loosely stated, is I'm looking at the world's oldest companies and institutions and traditions to understand what it takes to remain resilient and to outlast and to really survive over the long term. And what, especially in some of the really old businesses, the companies that have been around for over 1,000 years, there is a really almost like kind of dramatic tradition of craftsmanship towards the actual product or service, which I actually do think is a reflection of how a company and its leaders feel about their customers, that their customers really deserve something very, very high quality. I think that there's a real lost art of quality generally now. I think that we make things really fast, we produce things really fast. And to Elie's point, I mean, there's a lot of transactional types of relationships, whether it's your cab driver. And I think as the world gets more kind of complex and more global and people move around more, it's very easy to fall into this dynamic of, well, I'm never going to see this person again, so what do I really care? And I increasingly am starting to see this also, not just in the relationship with customers, but in the relationship with employees and the firms that they work at. So companies that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, have employees typically that also stay very long company. Whereas now the turnover rate within companies is at all-time highs. All the academic research is showing people are just staying at companies for shorter and shorter time spans. And so what ends up happening is that there's ultimately kind of a mentality of, I'm in London right now, I'm in a hotel room. I try to keep pretty clean, but am I treating the room as clean as I would if I was staying at a friend's house? Maybe not. And same thing with employees at companies. If you're an employee of a company and you believe you're going to be there for 30 years, you are treating everything with a lot of respect, with a lot of care. You're treating your colleagues really kindly, your customers, all stakeholders. But if you're an employee of a company and you know you're going to leave in 2 years, then it just changes the dynamic of how you treat everyone in your surroundings and the product itself. You're potentially cutting corners. You're doing things maybe to move up quickly. And ultimately, you're maybe not that embedded in the long-term success of the firm, making sure that the product or service is as great as it, has to be. So I'm using all of this as just kind of a filter for how I think about just my own business, the world, investments that we make, and ultimately how to make kind of high quality decisions. So yeah, I mean, you see it not just within customer relationships, but you see it all across the board. I think what we're really getting to try to distill it down is having a really high respect for relationships across the board, whether it's with your customers, your employees, and other stakeholders, and certainly within the community. And I keep finding examples of companies that inevitably hit some crisis in thousands of years of being in business. Some companies have been around since looking at one hotel in Japan that opened in the year 568. So they've been around. And what's interesting to me is they will inevitably have these crises where there'll be some massive earthquake or tsunami or political regime change or technological change. And the community comes and actually helps the business, which is very unique. I think modern capitalism doesn't really have this idea that, the cities or the communities that you live in should help the businesses, and likewise the businesses. I think you have nods to this. I think you have kind of like, oh, we give 1% of our, gross profit or net income to some local charity, but it's not embedded within the culture. I think it's natural as businesses get bigger and it's just harder to maintain. But it's something that I think is increasingly important to think about if you want to have a resilient culture, is how you interact with your local community. And again, all of these things, they should be very obvious. But I think when you're just reading the newspaper or you're reading, kind of like just you're scrolling Twitter, these ideas just don't surface naturally. It kind of takes like a slowing down and sort of slow analysis to peel back the layers on some of these things. And yeah, I mean, what I'm finding is like, it's all very obvious and simple, but kind of obscured.
Yeah. I mean, we spent a lot of time with clients talking. I came up with this cheeky acronym for risk: reputational intelligence, stakeholder knowledge. We spent a lot of time with clients working through their stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholders, it's not just shareholders, it's not just employees, it's not just customers. It's what is the community you're working in? We're working with a company that has a very small town presence. And one of the first things that I say to companies when they're working kind of in small towns is go sponsor the local Little League team. Get your name associated with that. Do something at the local school. I mean, these are small communities. But I think, Eric, what I was thinking while you were talking about it is there's always been a difference between like high-end stuff, right? Customers of high-end stuff expect personal relationships. You're buying a Ferrari, you're buying a Longines watch, whatever it is. Like there's an expectation that you have a one-on-one personal relationship, either with a specific salesperson or with the company in general. They're going to take care of you for the long term. I think the difference is those companies that we were talking about earlier, the Amazon, the American Expresses, where it's mass, and yet still customers or clients still, or with American Express, just the fact that your card says member since, right? You're not a customer, you're a member, something, right? Whatever the hell that is, but you're a member of it. It's a very different mentality, I think, for a mass company that has, share prices and international presence to develop those relationships, at least in a less transactional way. Maybe it's still transitory, but it's not transactional way. And some of these companies that are, Lloyd's of London or something that's been around for hundreds of years and has clients that have probably been around for hundreds of years, right? There's this difference. And I think, it went from, I don't know. Do you or anybody you know have a tab at their local bar? Is that something that exists anymore? Right? Like my local, I wandered in the other day. I happened to have left the apartment without my wallet. Bartender didn't he was like, you'll get me next time. That was fine. But like, that wouldn't be something that I would expect. My local in the city, when I still lived in New York, same kind of thing. Like, it's not just that they're comping you every, fifth drink or fourth drink, whatever it is. There's a trust because they know you've developed a relationship either with the owner, with the bartender, with the other customers. Maybe that's why you come back, or the other clientele, right? The other regulars. I know that's the reason that I often go back to the same bars, because I like the people there. And it's a harder model. As you get larger and larger and more international with different cultures, it becomes harder and harder to repeat that, or at least make it scalable.
Two quick thoughts about, obviously, if you want to direct the conversation, please do. But I forget who I was watching, and Matt, it might have been you, but someone was talking about this recently with restaurants, and how at a specific restaurant they went to, I think it may have been a Derek Thompson article actually in the Atlantic, but that he would go to this one restaurant, and there used to be a lively scene at the bar, and
I just read this, yeah,
right, and so what's happened over basically the last 5 years is that bar has become the takeout counter. So no one ever sits there. There's just a row of bags of food, and the DoorDash guy would come in and out and take the food, and it's completely transactional. And the owner of the restaurant kind of hates it. I think that there was a sense of community. So I think that's just one element that we're actually seeing it play out, and now how to maybe think about recreating these spaces. If you want to, I mean, I think there's totally reasonable reasons to not want to do this. Elie, you mentioned Lloyd's. It's funny timing. I'm going there tomorrow for a tour of their underwriting room, because there's a chapter in my project that's basically about what Lloyd's has done that I think is interesting. Is they have an underwriting room that's basically started as a coffee shop in the late 1600s to get maritime insurance. Now it's a massive company. But what they are emphatic about in their underwriting room is face-to-face relationships. So even during COVID, their leadership, as soon as the mandates were lifted, they had people coming back in. Their belief was that face-to-face business was essential. And one of my arguments, and we have no position in Lloyd's, there's no investment into it, it's just as an observation. One of my ideas around resiliency and some of these companies that have been able to maintain kind of their status and their kind of longevity is like this idea of consistently being face-to-face with your stakeholders. So in a world where we're able to do this obviously digitally, there's an increasing, I think, momentum to being able to just kind of cut travel costs by just doing Zooms. I think that there's actually a lot of alpha and advantage and edge to be gained by doing the opposite. It's like, frankly, why I'm here in London. I'm just taking in-person, face-to-face meetings and doing in-person, face-to-face research, because I think my bet is that over the long term, the quality of these relationships I build by in-person interactions will dramatically outperform any short-term kind of just quick Zoom call I do with someone. So I think we are like very much in love with technology right now, because it makes things so much better. And I am not a Luddite whatsoever. I completely am like a pro-capitalist, pro-technology. Like, I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for technology. And frankly, a lot of us wouldn't be alive if it weren't for technology. I think that it's a bit like, we just don't really know how much to use it. I mean, we have a 3.5-year-old, right? And if we give her an iPad, she'll use it for 16 hours a day, right? Like, and I think we're like that with our phones and email and text messaging and, all of kind of like our interaction with and I think we don't really yet understand how harmful it is to us. I think in 50 years, we'll probably look back and say, yeah, this stuff was really hurting us, just like cigarettes hurt us, basically since, for hundreds of years. So it's just about modulating our use of these technologies to use them to increase efficiency, but also not be sort of respectful about boundaries with them, and make sure that we're not kind of overutilizing them. I think that, I've kind of said this a couple times now, I'm just trying to figure this out myself, but I do think that when it comes to AI, that if you're not using it enough, then you're likely falling behind. But if you're using it too much, then your quality is going to go down. So you have to find the right balance. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at in all of this.
Yeah. Like I'm not necessarily a Luddite. I do think that AI is going to lead us to Skynet. Like I am in that camp that's the direction that this is going to go, unless somebody pulls the plug at some point, which, Eric Schmidt has publicly said somebody's going to have to pull the plug at some point. But there was a story on NPR yesterday. There was a professor, I think it was University of Texas at Austin, did a study getting people to, leave their phones behind for a half hour or just use dumb phones or, whatever else it was. And the result that they found, you again, smaller sample, was the effect that it was having on people was almost as successful as antidepressants are, right? Like the cigarette analogy is the one that, a lot of people who are trying to push back on social media comes out like that. It makes sense. Like we all know it's wrong, but we haven't figured out kind of like that balance, right? Like I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. The 7-year-old, partially because, she was a 2-year-old during the pandemic, is like a natural on an iPad. She's downstairs right now in her room because she's sick with an iPad. I don't like that, but it's also like I'm Sabbath observant. So my phone gets turned off for 25 hours a week. It is gone. I am not looking at it. I don't hear it. I don't see it. And I'm pretty sure it's one of the reasons that I'm able to like function as a human being. I'm also like very cognizant. I don't have alerts set up on my phone. Like just text messages are the only thing that I get. But I was over at a friend's house. He has older kids also. And I think they're both 12. There were two 12-year-olds sitting on a couch. One was on a couch. One was on a chair. They were both just sitting there. They weren't talking to each other. They were sitting there. They were texting each other. Like when we get to the point of the complete, break of, again, going back to dating, right? Like it used to be you had to walk up to somebody and talk to them. Now you just swipe. Like what is that doing in terms of kind of just the building of relationships or the ability to people interact with one another? I said something like offhandedly to somebody the other day and like we ended up having a whole conversation about it. So I use Claude, the Anthropic model. My business partner uses ChatGPT. We kind of balance it out and we use it for various different things. But I make a point of being polite to it, partially because like the back of my head, I'm worried it's going to take over and we're all going to die. So I may as well be like a nice person about it. But I got into a whole conversation with somebody about like, if this is going to be the future going forward, regardless if it becomes sentient or not, if this becomes the primary thing that our kids are interacting with on a day-to-day basis, shouldn't we be teaching manners about it? Say please and thank you. But it becomes a weird thing because it's ones and zeros. So, I think, going back to the relationship part, it's becoming increasingly hard. And I think, at least 3 times a week, I look at dumb phones online. Like I'm done with this. I just need a dumb phone. You can call me and I can get directions and that maybe listen to a podcast. And that's it. And I'm not even that particularly addicted to my phone. Like I know other people who they have all the alerts. They're pulling it out all the time. I see it at bars, right? Like I can sit at a bar and have a conversation with somebody with my phone in my pocket, or maybe it's on the counter and I'll peek at it every now and again. Keep talking about bars. And I don't think I spend that much time in bars. It's just, I work from home and I work alone. So like it is one of my only social outlets.
Maybe you want to spend more time in bars.
Well, the dream is to win the lottery and then I can open the bar that I've had in the back of my head. I want to call it the gym. That's my dream. I want to run a bar called the gym.
So people can say I'm going to the gym and you're the
exactly.
My bar idea is called the Nudnik, which Elie, you might appreciate.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Explain Nudnik to my
Nudnik?
non-Jewish household name.
And to your viewers, Nudnik. The Nudnik is just kind of it's like a schmagegi, right? It's a Nudnik is someone who's at least sort of like a rascal. A rascal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pain in the ass.
Yeah.
An imp.
Yeah. A Nudnik. Don't be a Nudnik.
Thank you for the non-Yiddish viewers.
There's going to be a lot of Yiddish in this.
There's going to be a lot of Yiddish in this one. All right. So what about, actually, time out 1 second. Eric, watch your microphone. Because I think, are you using your headset mic?
Yeah. Is it bad?
It's fine. No, the mic is fine. It's like, occasionally I think it gets stuck on your shirt or your collar. Usually what I do if I'm stuck on that is I just kind of like loop my thumb in it or something. So it just doesn't,
that's what
hangs off my face. Cool. Your gorgeous facial hair is probably going to find
That's all AI.
Yeah,
that's all AI. Yeah.
Let's hit at it. All right. So apart
I'm
from
actually 105 years old.
You're the, what is it? The 1,000-year-old man? I'm really, and to the point of what you're just saying, not the Nudnik part, the part about, it feels like we are increasingly in a world where we have to communicate cross generations, where there's a different understanding of relationships. And I'm thinking about this in the stakeholder communications. I'm thinking about this as like both of you as parents. And granted, the kids aren't quite to the age, it sounds like, where you're having to totally grapple with this yet. But different generations are going to have very different ideas about what a meaningful relationship it is with probably a non-parental family member. How do you even start to like think about that? Like Elie, like Do you wrap your head around it? Do you just get angry about it? Where are you?
I mean, both. Like every time I take a step back and like start banging my head against the wall, I try to think about like what can I do to fix the situation? Right. In terms of like social media and phones and all that, my wife and I are on a committee at our elder daughter's school. The younger one will be joining her there next year. Of trying to figure out what the policies should be, right? Like there's, wait till 8. Wait. There's the wait to 8th grade movement. Is that enough? Like Australia just passed laws banning social media for kids under 16. And I don't even know if that's enough. Right? Like but to your point, it's not just that they're entering they're entering situations with a very different grasp of kind of interpersonal relationships. To some extent, they're entering an alternative reality, which becomes really problematic, especially when, if they've only been exposed to, I don't want to get too political, but like one of the reasons that the Trump MAGA movement has been resilient over the last 8 years, right, is he creates an alternative reality for his supporters. He said it, right? What you see and what you read is not what's really happening. What Doge is doing is, right, like, what is it? 16% of the US budget is discretionary. Like when they announced this Doge thing, like the first thought in my head was like, oh, they don't understand the difference between discretionary and non-discretionary. And that's going to be a really uncomfortable conversation with somebody. But they're talking about all these great things that they're doing. But, interestingly, sure, you can cancel a contract that was for, $75,000 to, promote literacy in, I don't know, Saskatchewan. That's great. But that money's already out the door. So you canceled it. Great. You can take credit for it, but didn't shave any money off the budget. And at the end of the day, when you're dealing with trillions of dollars, right? Again, it just goes back to this idea that Trump is out there saying that Ukraine started the war against Russia. How many people are now locked into that as the reality? And I think going back to the AI thing, it still hallucinates, but it also is only as good as the information it's getting, right? Like I'll ask Claude something. I call it Sven. Then I said I was being polite to it, but I fight with it about this because it keeps saying my name is Claude. Like, no, you're Sven. I pay for you. Your name is Sven. I'm going to be that guy. I'll still say please and thank you, but you're Sven. It will tell me like, oh, I only have information up until this date when I ask it, when I'll ask it certain questions. So as we move from a transactional relationship, right, with Google, when we want something, we Google something, right? Like sometimes some of the stuff that I'm good at professionally is I'm just a better Googler than other people for some things, right? I know how to manipulate the algorithm a little bit better.
Google foo is real. We learned Google foo.
Google Jedis. It's a real thing. But that's just directional, right? You search something, the algorithm pops something up. You can sort of, work on the algorithm in the background a little bit to get some SEO, whatever else it is. But when we move into more of a transactional search relationship, now what AI is giving you back is what AI has decided you should have. And it's not giving you the option of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th page of answers. And I think that is something that's really worrisome. Where is it getting information? What is the algorithm behind it that's promoting what information you can get, right? We just saw with the DeepSeek, with Great DeepSeek in China. That's the name of the AI company, right? Somebody did a Google search for did a search on it for Tiananmen Square, and it's just not there. Like there's just no information about it.
Yeah.
So, the fact, and what concerns me is that the folks who are running the largest AI companies, whether it's Elon Musk or Sam Altman, they are distinctly, inherently not good actors. They're just not. Sam Altman already got fired once for not being a good actor. Elon Musk is clearly not a good actor. So we're putting a lot of faith in a very few people, and we're repositioning the entire world around these various different algorithms without really understanding what it is. So they, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whatever it was, they all came out, a group of them came out, lengthy statement that basically said, please regulate us. And everybody sort of ignored it. Not like, this is too cool. We don't want to regulate you. We don't want to inhibit capitalism. Like, let's go, get better and better and better. Then a couple of weeks later, they come out with like a 1-sentence thing that's saying like, got to regulate us. We're going to destroy the world. Right. So it's governments are terrible at regulating nation technology. I mean, just look at social media, right? Like you have Orrin Hatch sitting there asking how Facebook makes money. right? Like it's bad. And when you have bad actors involved, or not necessarily bad actors, but when you have people who, I don't know Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know if he's a good person or a bad person. I just know what I see on television. And he comes across to me as somebody who's just, he made a program to rate girls' hotness and kind of went out of control. But if that was your base reason for doing this, why are we entrusting society to you? Maybe we should be looking for somebody better to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons that Eric Schmidt is out there, kind of the former Google chairman, is out there really like talking about the perils that are not too far off in the distant future. So I'm going to continue being nice to Sven because the Terminator's coming.
I can take maybe the counter argument if it's helpful, just to stimulate the conversation.
Let's do this.
I think that throughout history, new technologies have always been met with a lot of fear and skepticism and cynicism. And I share a lot of skepticism that you have, Elie. I think that I would maybe push a little bit, not so much on like the individual personalities leading this, but for the potential for humanity to unlock some really great and really, I think, profound achievements, not just across science and technology, but actually across the arts and across human consciousness itself. And for the ability to find new ways of spending their time that's more meaningful. I think if I think a lot about, a lot of the current jobs that exist now and a lot of the world's problems, look, we can say like, oh, humanoid robots in your house, is a terrible thing. You wouldn't want, but, on the flip side,
I don't like changing diapers.
Yeah. I mean, if a robot could change diapers, I'd totally take that deal. I think my point at a high level is that we don't yet, the cards haven't been fully dealt. And I think that there's going to be some like truly positive things that come as a result of some of these large scale infrastructure AI changes that we haven't even scratched the surface of. So I'm like, what people might call a techno-optimist. I've thought a lot about these questions. I think that in the short term, there's going to potentially be a great deal of misinformation, of chaos. But over the long term, I think let's just use like the internet as an example. Was the internet a force function for good or bad in society? I still take the argument that it's better. It increases transparency, efficiency. New economies have been unlocked. It has brought people out of poverty. And so there's a million critiques to that argument that, it's increased the amount of misinformation, of wealth disparity, certainly of the aggregation of a lot of value in a handful, just a small handful of people. But, I think that we shouldn't be so maybe naive or Pollyannish to what's really happening in some of like the worst economies, the worst jobs. Like, I think technology can actually lift economies and people out of really bad situations. And I think, just on a personal level, like I find it really, I think it's like an incredible time to be alive, truly. Like if we just think about the long time span of human history, like we're all roughly the same age. To be alive during the internet revolution and now the AI revolution, maybe I'm wrong and like the world ends in 3 minutes, but like this is all like a disaster. But at the very least, it is like one of them. I mean, I'd put it on par with it's the Renaissance or it's the Industrial Revolution on steroids. And we're just at, I think, in like the knee of some really big S curve that's about to take off. And so I wouldn't trade it, as many problems as I think there are going to be as a result of it. I would counter that maybe there's actually net problems being solved. So I don't know, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet kind of thing.
I don't disagree with any of that. Right. I think, but the analogy you just brought to the Industrial Revolution or, the printing press, right? I think, and then you said, we have been alive to the internet revolution and now the AI revolution. Those are two monumental things that we've experienced in the span of 30 years, roughly, right? The printing press took decades to catch on. The Renaissance was centuries. I think part of where my concern lies is I don't think as a species, we can handle this much change this quickly. We're still coming to grips about the impact of the internet because we're still coming to grips with the impact of social media. I still want somebody to defend that social media is a good thing without mentioning the Arab Spring, right? Like we are so slow to think about how long it took us to ban cigarettes, to go back to the cigarettes analogy. Like we knew forever that it was a bad idea. Even with the misinformation and disinformation that the cigarette companies were pumping out about it, everybody knew it was bad because you smoked, you got sick, you died. Like it was pretty straight line. I think that big part of my concern is that, and I'm not worried about change, right? Like we all do a lot of change on a daily basis, right? Like you had a kid, right? That's a big change. You got married, you moved. Those are all big, humongous, monumental changes that are going to change jobs, huge lifestyle change. I'm not like the change aspect isn't what I worry about. I worry about the society's inability to digest the change at the speed at which it's happening. Because, don't forget, like we still don't have universal internet access. So there's huge chunks of society, both American and globally, that haven't even experienced the things that we experienced 30 years ago when we got the stupid AOL discs.
Yeah. I, just to make this maybe to bring it more around to like some practical,
let's make a
points. Yeah. Let's keep philosophizing. No, I wrote a piece like a year ago and, it was kind of confronting this question. I think the title of the piece was, where the human brain still has an edge over AI. And, I kind of came away with two answers. One was sort of an idea borrowed from Jeff Bezos, which is that real innovation comes from wandering. This idea that, that like really the best ideas get unlocked when you're kind of, just sort of going down different rabbit holes and not really, having a direct way of approaching a problem. You're just sort of experimenting. I mentioned that because you brought up how instead of now Googling, you just kind of go to ChatGPT or Claude and you just ask it to kind of do that work for you. So a way to, I think, create an advantage for yourself is to really embrace this meandering mindset of just reading interesting things, of not just simply going to the ChatGPT search bar and saying, find me the answer to something.
Oh, yeah.
Because more often than not, you're going to that's where actually really interesting ideas get unlocked, is when you kind of just have a conversation with someone, or you just, are going through
a Google hole.
You go down a Google hole, you just go to Wikipedia, you go to some footnote, you go to the article. Like that, I think actually is an advantage, whereas a lot of people may perceive that as being sort of like lazy and, not spending their time efficiently.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, if you just look at some of like the most profound innovations over the last couple of hundred years, even a couple thousand years, they often come not from relentless pursuit of some experiment and trying to get something done, but actually like a total mistake. So the example that I give is, Alexander Fleming, created I'm forgetting the penicillin. So penicillin was created basically out of a mistake. He went on vacation for a couple of weeks, came back, and his petri dishes were covered in mold, and said, "What the hell is this?" And that's ultimately, how he kind of came to the idea of penicillin. And I think the point in there for me is, LLMs are trained to be correct, to give you the correct answer. And there's like so much value in making mistakes. We've all experienced this personally. Like the only growth you ever have is from making some big mistake. And my fear with my daughter's generation increasingly relying on AI to come up with answers, to give them the correct output for some question they have, is that I fear actually not that they're going to make mistakes, but that they won't make mistakes in certain maybe more philosophical research questions that they have for, their own lives. I think that kids will always make mistakes just going out and doing silly things. But when we think about more like intellectual work, some of the biggest, just value in my career was just kind of making mistakes in articles that I wrote, investments that we made, just like those are relationships that I kind of messed up by not doing something correctly or not, and my fear with AI is that as people kind of become the perfect versions of themselves, the most optimized versions, that actually the feedback loop will be negative to make us kind of less resilient, less innovative, less maybe even thoughtful long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're already seeing some of that, right? Like, we still had the internet pre-Wikipedia, right? Like, think about like the impact Wikipedia had on how you do research on a day-to-day basis, right? And AI is just that on like not even speed, like crack mixed with speed, mixed with something else, mixed with something else. And yeah, I mean, the vast majority of things I've learned is when I click on the footnote and I go down some weird path that ends up, on my Amazon wish list, and then can't sleep one night and I buy some crazy book that I saw in a footnote for $0.25 and read that and learn something new and then go on to something else. And I think that's part of my concern of how do my kids, how do they do that exploration when it's just given to them, right? Like the fact that somebody writing a research paper now, sixth grader writing a paper on, I don't know, Alexander Graham Bell, gets it from Wikipedia, and maybe they click on a couple links so it doesn't look like they just copy and pasted from Wikipedia. Fine. But what happens in the next turn of that? Like the fact that you and I, the three of us, all remember writing papers by hand, right? My kids, I'm amazed that they're actually learning how to write.
Yeah.
And they're definitely not learning cursive. Like that's gone.
Well, it's really a question for both of you. Like, was there value? And I think it's important to really be honest about, was there value in having to go to the library and, pick up a bunch of books that didn't give you the answer you were looking for? I see both sides of it. I think that there's an argument that no, you wasted a lot of time looking at the code or whatever, you had to do, and you had to talk to people, and, you like the book was maybe not there. So you had to wait a week for it to come back. I'm probably more on the other camp of the act of discovery at that stage in life, and frankly, throughout your entire life, it's more important if you actually want to have good ideas to kind of like do the work that doesn't scale and that's inefficient and slow. And, it's like requires a lot of patience, and, like the Latin root of patience is suffering. It's like not, it's not, I think we're like all optimized for speed and doing things like kind of getting instant gratification. But I think a lot about like the real, where does value accrue over the long term? And I increasingly am feeling that rejecting certain shortcuts. We use like OpenAI deep research throughout, like we research stocks using it. It's amazing. It's like having 50 research analysts on, on staff at all times working 24/7. But where it doesn't actually provide value is like developing conviction in anything. So you can get a lot of good ideas really fast. You can do best stock research in the world. You can come up with a great research report, but if the stock is down 30%, does it really matter? Do you have conviction? Should I hold this? Should I buy more? Should I sell it? That's the interesting question, is like the work that doesn't scale may actually be the most valuable stuff. And
that's the wandering part.
Yeah. I think like wandering, and frankly, just being okay with being slower than your competitor, might make you lose out in the short term, but over the long term, it might make you less fragile.
Yeah, I remember I was onboarding a junior when I had junior staffers. Now I don't need junior staffers because I have Perplexity and Claude, and like that's no joke. Like I don't know, so I can use them pretty effectively. I'm saying sort of the same way that you guys can, because we have 20 plus years of experience of doing the actual work. So I can give it a prompt because I know exactly what I need from it. I just don't have the time or the patience or the energy to go find it myself. But I don't know how a junior person gets that 20 years of experience if they're relying on, to Eric's point, they're relying on the correct answer isn't necessarily the right answer, or vice versa, right? So I had, this is years ago. So before pre-AI, I was onboarding a junior colleague, and in the conversation, she said to me, "So I know there are no stupid questions." I was like, "What? Let me stop you right there. There are stupid questions." She said, "What do you mean? I thought there were no stupid questions?" I said, "If you can Google it faster than I can, it's a stupid question to ask me."
Yeah.
Otherwise, ask anything. I will spend as much time as we need to walk through something. You can write something, and if I have to turn it into an entire page of red, I will sit there and work with you step by step by step. But if you have something factually wrong that you could have Googled and gotten right, that's just bad form, right? Like I think to your point, right? Like I spent some time training Sven to write, like I uploaded a whole bunch of articles I had written, ghosted, whatever else. And each time it would like come back saying like, oh, I learned X, Y, and Z from you. Then after about, I don't know, half hour of doing this, uploading a dozen plus articles, I asked it to write 500 words on something in my voice. And it came out. I sent it to my business partner and he's like, this is really good. And I was like, I didn't write it at all. Right? Like usually like if we exchange drafts of things that AI touched at some level, we can tell, right? Like we know we've known each other a very long time. We've been working very closely together for a couple of years now, but we've known each other for much longer. We worked together, 20 years ago. But I sent it to my wife. She had no idea that I hadn't written it, but the piece itself was entirely wrong, right? It reached the wrong conclusions based on the prompt that I gave it, but it was so in my voice to the point, like it had the snide kind of like side comments that I sometimes write into op-eds. It was incredible that it was that good of a mimic, but it was wrong.
Cool.
What do you think about tools like this and I think we're in a unique spot. I think anybody probably early to mid 30s up to like 50-ish is in this unique spot where they can see these tools as valuable editors. And because they can see them as valuable editors, they're terrified of what it means for the generation below us in age. And we also look at the generation above us in age, like 50 something plus really, or the people who are just, it's not worth it in their career or whatever else to invest the time. We've met the people who will take that investment either, but there's also those who are just like, it was hard enough getting me, do I really have to get email on my smartphone or whatever? And I think we're in a unique spot for back to the reputation and branding thing of being able to help people understand here is probably generalizing older generations. Here's the value in this thing, but then younger generations, here's the friggin' danger in this thing because it can be totally compelling. You can actually pretend to be me, junior associate, and pull this off, but you might have the exact wrong conclusion that you're making. And you might wrongly put conviction in it. How do you think about that? Elie first.
I mean, it's the promise and peril, right? Of all things. There are very, very few things in the world that are all good or all bad, right? They exist, but there are very, very few of them. And that could potentially change from person to person, right? So like objectively, there are very few things that are clear-cut good or clear-cut bad. And I think into what Eric's point was of kind of like becoming the perfect versions of ourselves, thanks to what AI can give us, we get closer to that idea that something is all good. We have to continuously, part of the, where I was coming from at the Skynet and kind of, oh my God, the sky is falling kind of stuff. Again, going back to kind of red teaming, that's me poking holes in things. I'm looking for the problems. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm good at my job. I don't think that it's the thing I learned from my job. I think it's kind of just, I was naturally like that, questioning things and looking for problems, and not necessarily a super fun way to go through life. I've been pretty good career-wise with it. And I worry about, you can't read, what kid today can read a map?
Yeah.
When was the last time you drove somewhere that you didn't know where you're going without relying on Google Maps or Waze or something, right? Like it's just not a thing that you think about anymore. So I think you always have to promise, do the balance of promise and peril. Again, picking on social media again, the promise, I'm still not entirely sure where it is. I see lots and lots of peril, but, looking at, my parents being able to look at pictures of my kids, or again, I want somebody to defend social media without bringing up the Arab Spring, which again, speaking of things that are not all good, it's just, there's this promise and peril, right? And if and when you going back way earlier to what we were talking about in terms of kind of when you introduce your brand, going back to the Theranos example, if they introduce a little bit more of the peril into the promise, they'd probably still be in business. It's just like the reality is, to be honest with your kids or with yourself, is you got to figure out what that balance is. Where's the promise? Where's the peril? What do you need to be worried about? What are the things that you're going to benefit from it? And does one outweigh the other, right? You got to break out the yellow legal pad and do a plus minus column.
Yeah. Like, I think that you can there's a few filtering mechanisms you can apply to some of these questions. For me, I just like to look at it, does this decision increase or decrease the odds of long-term survival? So if I'm like going to completely just, like to use your Google Maps example, or kids using maps, they just don't know how to like get directions. And frankly, I've gotten really bad at directions. And I think it's just because I'm so reliant on when I, get into my car, I just put in the address and I just drive. And I think that actually, if I was going to be very honest with myself, like using some of these systems has decreased my resilience in like one of these like right tail events, right? So that's like a really good push. On the,
but to going back to the map point, like that's a perfect example, right? Like people used to be able to read the stars, right? And then they could use a compass, and then they could read a map, and now you can do that. Like soon it's going to be self-driving cars, so you wouldn't even have to, think about following direction. So, yes, technology improves humanity at some level, but there's always a consequence, right? Like you invent fire, great, you can stay warm, you can cook things, but you can burn shit down.
Right. And what I was going to say next is exactly, I think the way I frame it, and I think may be helpful for people, is there's just no such thing as a free lunch. Like, there's always a trade-off. And so intuitively, we know this when we're using AI to do something that we used to do that maybe took us time. There's definite benefits to it, but we are losing something. And it very well could be a net positive trade, like in a pure math sense, like me spending, an hour to write the perfect long email versus just put my vomit draft into ChatGPT and say, just make this email better. And it does a much better job, right? Like, I think that that's net positive. There's for sure things lost because I think in writing a lot, you're structuring your own thoughts. And so if people lose the ability to write, my fear is that people will lose the ability to structure their thoughts, and, ideas will become worse over time. So I'm a big believer in like the value of writing. I just wonder, like, to what extent, like, some type of writing is really important and some type is kind of like, it's not that important. So you can outsource it. But I think, like, again, it's like, there's no real shortcuts. There is always some cost to doing this. Like everything we've ever invented, any sort of innovation, even if there's like a net I mean, look at cars, right? Like cars is the ultimate, there's a great book by Alistair Nairn about just like these new, any sort of new technology that creates like an incredible new efficiency, increases GDP. Like there's net benefits, but there's also like 50,000 a year who die in traffic accidents, and, the amount of carbon emissions and all this. But it's like on a net basis, positive, there's always going to be some sort of cost for these things. And I guess I'd sum it up by saying like, AI is no different. It is just, it is just this on a more profound and, Elie, to your point, it's on like super steroids. It's all of these new technologies rolled up into one massive new technology. And do I think the world is prepared for it? Not at all. Like, I think given like how I spend my time looking at, like I spend a lot of time looking at the companies that are kind of on the edge of it. And I'm like, most people have, the three of us probably have a pretty good sense of it, but like 99% of the public does not really have a sense of what these tools will be capable of very soon, if not already.
Yeah.
Well, between me, you, and Sven, Claude to some, we've got some notes. I'll take you guys through these notes. I invite you to freely interrupt me because there's just so much of this stuff that I want to just hit on before we close this out. We started talking about brand and reputation, and that gap. Elie, you talked about it as risk aperture. I need to stick on this one just for a minute. Like risk, and you have that great acronym for risk that you use. How do you define risk? And then Eric, you've traversed this in like the investment world and the investigative journalist world. Like, define the word risk to you. How do you think about it in your terms, Elie?
So I look at risk on a spectrum, and the way we talk about it with clients, right? There's risks, issues, and crises. And there are three distinct things that are interrelated, but they're distinct. The analogy that I've been using, and maybe I need to update a little bit, but is risks are generally objective, right? So air travel has inherent objective risks associated with it. You're defeating gravity, et cetera, all those sorts of things. Now there are issues associated with when you get on a plane of the pilot had a bad day, it's bad weather, or you're on a goddamn Boeing plane, right? There are issues that now you have to face by making that decision. You already taken the risk of deciding to go for air travel. Now you're making decisions to get on that plane, or you're being assigned to that plane. And then there are crises. And in the airplane analogy, right? It's air travel is a risk. Boeing is the issue. The door blowing off is the crisis. So I look at risks as anything you do, there's a risk associated, right? With promise and peril. That's what we were just talking about. Anything you do, there's associated risk. Even sitting in your house by yourself, doing nothing, there's risk associated with that, right? You're going to atrophy. You're not going to have social interaction. You're going to get fat, like whatever else it is, right? Doing nothing comes with its own risks. Doing drugs comes with risks. There's all these different sorts of things. I think that when I talk about the spread between brand and reputation is, again, it's that gap between the expectations that people have of you or your company. And the more that spread opens it up to, are there regulatory risks? Are there legal risks? Are there consumer risks? Are there stakeholder risks? Are there employee risks? These are all different things that kind of layer on top of each other. And you end up in a potential situation where it's cascading, right? It's not just that they're all happening at once. It's that one's impacting the other, right? If employees are unhappy, they're not making good product, which means you're not going to be able to sell it. So now you have financial problems, and now you don't have any customers. But also on top of that, somebody, slips something into the pills, and now you have, a health hazard out there. And then you have regulatory challenges with that. And then there's the legal action that comes on, right? And it all cascades one after another. So it's taking that look of, what's your tolerance for risk as a human? What's your tolerance for risk as an organization? And kind of, plotting it out on the impact and likelihood scale, right? Like, we know that the impact of burning coal is guaranteed. There's a guaranteed impact of burning coal. People get lung cancer. It's bad for the air. But we know this. This is unquestionable science. It's being questioned now again for unbeknownst reasons. But it is, uncontroversial that burning coal is not the best way to make energy. What's a cleaner way to make energy? Nuclear energy, right? Now, the impact of coal is a constant. The likelihood of an impact from nuclear, the impact of it is huge. Of something going wrong in a nuclear plant, the likelihood of it is very low. Whereas with coal, the impact might be mitigated because it's just air pollution, but the likelihood is guaranteed. So going outside, the likelihood of you getting struck by a car is low. The impact of it is very high. The likelihood of a bird crapping on you is low. The impact of it is also low. It's just a bird crapping. Now that impact might be different if you're going to a job interview, or, you're wearing a fancy coat that isn't dry clean, is dry clean only, whatever else it is. So again, I think it's, it's balance. It's always a balance. There's always a balance. And you don't want to, I try to impress upon my kids that you do have to weigh these things. What Eric was saying before, like, not everything's a positive, not everything's a negative. Like, you can go do that. Like, I'm going to let you go experiment, but I'm going to let you experiment where, you might bang your head. I'm not going to let you experiment where you might cut a limb off.
Sorry, kids, you can't play with that nuclear reactor today. That's just giving you the piece of coal. Eric,
right, exactly.
Eric, what about you and risk? And feel free if you want to put the full investor hat on. I'll let you go that way. But
no, I'll do that a little bit. Maybe first put the poker hat on, which I would consider a intellectual pursuit, which my wife would say would be a gambling pursuit. But I think a lot about risk through the lens of just expected value and probabilities. And, I just pulled it up because we wrote this for our site because I think it's also how I view it through an investing lens, which we get asked this question a lot. And I think it's a good one. And I think that the way that I'll read you what I wrote and I'll just talk about it. But, we define risk as the mismatch between our conviction in an investment and the actual long-term outcomes. So something that actually is like really high risk is something where our expectation of it deviates significantly from the actual outcome. So you may think like this investment idea is risky, but it's actually not risky if you understand what the expected value is. So if you understand that the expected value is that it could go down 60% or 80% or down to zero, and that's how you're thinking about the investment, or the idea within your portfolio, it's not actually as risky because it's kind of like that variance is accounted for, that expected value is kind of baked into what you assess its risk to be. The real risk comes from, it's kind of like, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher the Twain quote. I think it's a Mark Twain quote, but where you really get hurt is like what you think you know for sure, but just ain't so. It's where you really believe something and you're 100% sure that it's true, but it's not. That's like, to me, how to really think about risk. And when you think about risk across your life, across your investment portfolio, like what are you so sure about that could be wrong? Because that's actually the riskiest part of your investment. It's actually not risky if you invest in something knowing that it's risky. It's like there's an expectation there, right? You know that it could go down. So you're not going to put all of your eggs in that one basket. It's when you don't think it's risky and you say, well, it's not risky, so I'm just going to, put all my eggs in that basket, that it becomes very risky. So I think that's how I view it, which is constantly thinking about it in terms of expected value and kind of being just like deeply honest with myself and what I think I know about a situation versus what I could be getting wrong about it. That's where you get into a lot of trouble in investing.
Well, I think the poker analogy, I think, is really interesting, right? Like, I'm not a particularly good poker player. I just didn't grow up playing it. I'll play occasionally for, $20 games, that kind of, mostly just to be around, get together with friends and drink a couple of beers. But you and I, if we're sitting at the same table, or two different tables, but we have the same cards are on the table, we have the same cards in our hands, we have the exact same amount of money. Your risk is very different than my risk because you know more. You know more about what the potential is for your hand versus my hand. So I may make the decision to go all in because I've got pocket aces, something I've done way too many times and lost. Right. You may not, you're not going to make that same decision. Or if you do make that decision, it's because you calculated the odds in a different way because you know more about that situation.
Yeah.
Because you've built up the risk tolerance because you know more, right? This is what we talk about, like, going back to my stupid acronym, reputational intelligence, stakeholder knowledge. It's having that full kind of holistic spectrum of knowing what you're walking into.
Yeah.
And knowing that you're an idiot, right? Like, that's the other important part. Like, I constantly try to remember that I'm an idiot.
That's a big edge. I think in markets, there's just, it's called the greater fool theory. It's like, well, if you know that you are maybe, like, you don't want to be someone else's exit liquidity in a trade. So you just always want to know your role in what you are doing and be very honest about it. Like, am I owning this stock because I believe, the company is going to do X, Y, Z, or do I not really even understand it? And I think if you could just really be honest about why you do certain things, that actually de-risks a lot of decisions that you can make.
Stick with me on this one, Eric. Another thing that you brought up, we were talking about the relationships with customers and how actually, like, craftsmanship can actually be a way of de-risking a situation. And the specific thing that I'm thinking about is, this book keeps coming up in my life lately. I don't know why. Bo Burlingham's Small Giants. Have you guys read that book?
I used to work with him.
You used to work with Bo Burlingame.
Mm-hmm.
Even better. So one of the things I love in that book is a lot of these companies have local presences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that comes up over and over and over again in these companies is they have like an area that's really dedicated to them. And I can't remember if it was the pizza restaurant or something else that was like going out of business and they all fell in with.
I don't remember
the pizza restaurant or something.
Yeah, I worked there. My father owns that restaurant.
The idea of that local relationship when the risk gets turned up at the really nasty level, that's where people can kind of bail you out if you've invested in those relationships.
Yeah. So Bo, this was a long time ago, but he was at Inc. magazine where I started my career in New York. So he was, I think either the deputy, I forget exactly, but he wrote that book kind of, I think, while he was at Inc. I got to know him and his work. I think that the relationship with your community is really important. One tangible example in Japan that I found that I thought was really compelling was there are certain communities on coastal Japan that are really susceptible to tsunamis and have tsunami zones. And so for the last 2,000 years, historians have found that they would put these markers, these kind of large stones, as kind of demarcation zones of where the water went up to when the tsunami would bring the tides in. And so that was really benefit for not just the businesses there, but for the communities to basically say, hey, future communities never build below this line, right? And I think that's, to me, like a nice metaphor for how communities can interact with businesses, where we don't really have that now, because I think, everything kind of is a little bit more transactional and more fast paced. But if you have a really good relationship with your community as a business, then they're kind of looking out for you. They're looking out for your customers. They're looking out for your employees. And that, I think Elie brought this up, like it's kind of simple in some ways, like, yeah, just sponsor the kids, Little League, or just participate in some local charity. But I think my bet is that we see a resurgence of that, and that over time that, some of the businesses that do the best are the ones that aren't the ones that scale because, they have an international team and they move really quickly, but the ones that actually kind of accrue the most value are the ones that are deeply embedded within particular communities, like geographically based. Just a thesis, just an idea. I don't know if it's true, but this whole like sort of digital nomad culture of just kind of starting businesses online. And, now it's even more extreme with like, you have sort of agentic autonomous business ideas where humans are no longer even starting businesses anymore. It's all great. And I think that there's probably potential to make a lot of cash in the short term, but in terms of if your interest is in playing like a longer term game, then I would probably stay away from that model.
What do you think about that, Elie? Just the locality idea.
Yeah. I mean, you think about like Applebee's, like had this great commercial at some point when commercials were still a thing that you saw during while you were watching TV. It was all about like, a coach was retiring or a teacher was retiring or something. And like have this whole musical buildup. It was like to demonstrate that Applebee's is like really part of the community. Which in hindsight, I'm thinking about it, like that's actually a pretty big risk to take. Cause if they don't live up to that, story, customers are going to be really disappointed. Same thing with like, Olive Garden, like when you hear your family, really? Are you? Maybe if it's a franchise model, maybe in one place, maybe not necessarily in the next. I think in terms of like the one-on-one interaction or kind of the community aspect, I've been thinking about this a lot as the price of Bitcoin has just, exploded. I've never done any crypto stuff. We don't work with crypto companies. It's just not something that we're particularly, maybe I'm not smart enough to understand it, but part of the value of a country's currency is actually the people, right? Like forget about the fact that like my currency is worth more than yours because at the end of the day, my country can defeat yours, right? Like there is that base principle at some level in the value of currency. But it's also, where's the GDP coming from? Where's the economic drivers? Where's the debt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas with Bitcoin or any of the crypto exchanges, there's nothing. There's nothing. And like, that is almost to Eric's point just now, like it's a scary model to be repeated over and over again, where there's nothing, there's no inherent value based on people.
Yeah. I think the crypto bulls would flip that and say, exactly. It's totally decentralized.
Yeah,
It's not dependent on one country and
right.
currency or government. And that's what they like about it. So I think it's like,
right.
As Charlie Munger would say, invert.
Right. I mean, but that's the thesis, right? Like the question is, can the two exist together or not?
Which is probably good for counter argument, right? Like those counter arguments are actually what enable growth, because up to this point, that's maybe one of the most interesting things about crypto to me is like a compelling counter argument didn't exist before, because you would just have, I don't know, South American hyperinflation or something would be the thing you'd run into.
Right.
As like, that counter argument didn't work. But here's another alternate. I have to tell you both, you're talking about that. Can we confirm, is it a Derek Thompson piece about it's takeout at the bar?
Yeah.
That feels like a very Derek Thompson point.
Yeah.
So there was a local restaurant, Dugan's, here in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And Dugan's, the Irish pub, was basically halfway between the house I grew up in and the Little League field. So it was a very regular stop off as a family of three boys on like the way home, or especially like with me, like I would be in the car with dad to go pick up, pizza at Dugan's on a Friday night. So the main guy who's there, who's since passed away, and the restaurant, I guess, is apparently closed forever now, which greatly saddens me. But your food for takeout was never ready when you walked in the door. Right. And it was never ready to give, often dad in the 80s, early 90s, a chance to sit and have a beer while it's one more minute, sit and have a drink.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what that meant was that like dad or whoever's picking up the food has a drink. it was also one of those bars where it's totally acceptable to have like your 8-year-old kid like hanging out at the bar with you. And because the one time I went into that bar, I went to the jukebox and I played a Stevie Ray Vaughan song of all things. Every single time we walked into that bar, sorry, Jim, your pizza's not ready yet, but here's $1 for your son to go play on the jukebox because he played a good song that one time and I can trust his judgment.
Yeah, but it's not just that, right? Like nowadays, that same bar could exist, but I guarantee you, your dad's pulling out his phone when he sits down at the bar, right?
Yeah.
I know I do.
Yeah.
You know, even if I am talking to the bartender or the person sitting next to me, my phone's just there.
Yeah, I think the key point, Matt, though, is you know, there will always be value in strengthening those in-person relationships. Like I just firmly believe this. I think our business is putting, frankly, like all marketing budget for us. And this is what I've pushed for is like, just travel, just meet with people, be in person. Because I think that's increasingly becoming an advantage for a lot of reasons. Like I think it's strengthening, we're getting better investment ideas. We're, bringing on new investors into our funds. Like we are strengthening relationships with current clients. And I think we're all frankly kind of tired of Zoom calls after 4 or 5 years doing Zooms. I mean, like Matt, I came out to Northeastern Pennsylvania. We got the chance to hang out in person and it's like, that was awesome. Like that probably does not happen as often as it should. And I'm just like kind of on a campaign to just keep doing in-person stuff while I can, because it's fun. I think the other part of this is one of the other sort of chapters in my project is like fun. There's kind of a lost art of having fun in business. It used to be like you would go out with your colleagues and you'd have, maybe a couple of drinks for lunch, and that has kind of declined over time. Become very, you just catch up over the Zoom, but everyone's a little bit tired of doing that. And so how do you embed fun in the workplace, not in like a cheesy, hey, let's all go bowling with the team this Friday, but maybe that is the right way to do it. Finding ways to just kind of enjoy your time doing what you're doing, I think is a huge advantage. Like it gives you better ideas. It enables you to kind of keep going longer. Teams work better together. So it's just another sort of simple, obvious thing that I keep finding, having fun. And yet we don't really do it. Like it's just not part of the culture, really.
Yeah. I mean, I always, going back to the in-person thing, I always push clients like, no, we're going to go to New York. We're going to go to DC. We're going to go meet with reporters in person.
Yeah.
I can't, one of the hardest things to do, other than survive early on during the pandemic was trying to pitch reporters on stories over Zoom or over the phone where like they're, early on when every story was about COVID, right? And you're trying to pitch your nonsense bullshit product to your client or, I have an expert that can talk about, some nonsense. The reporters that, I used to go grab drinks with or, have lunch with, even without a client, are still people that I consider not just, good contacts, but friends, right? Like there's a reporter that I'm very friendly with in DC and I have breakfast with him every time I'm down there, or we try to have breakfast together every time I'm down there. And it's an important relationship, not just professionally, but like on a personal basis. And also going back to, he covers what the area that he covers is something that I'm not really, or I'm not as exposed to now than I was, a few years ago. But it's terrific to kind of get that download of what he's thinking. And he appreciates getting the download from what I'm thinking. And it goes back to kind of like, all right, if news stories are just going to be determined by plugging in a couple prompts, which, the journals, Wall Street Journal's already playing around with the lead. They have like the bullet points of what it's about. Like, okay, yeah, that's great. Like now you know what the bullet points are, but do you know what the story was about? Like I already read, Eric and I probably read the newspaper very differently than you do, Matt. Like, cause we know what goes into writing those stories. We know what that quote represents or like the amount of time that went into getting that quote right. Going back to kind of like the promise and the peril, like, yeah, you get time back, but what are you losing in terms of intellectual stimulation or growth?
I think about this a lot with and I want to go back to the meandering comment that we got stuck on there. You need that unstructured meandering. Like it's one thing for AI to be able to group unstructured data together and help us navigate or digest it. But this unstructured meandering, like with people, when you put 3 people in the room, that 3-body problem is a really cool 3-body problem to put them at the bar and see what happens because you really don't know where anything's going to go next.
Yeah. I think the word you're getting at, I think, is just serendipity. And I just keep finding that across
over and
you know,
over.
my career, my whole life is just, you know, the permanent value of serendipity and just kind of giving yourself enough surface area in your life to enable more serendipity.
What do you think about that, Elie?
Yeah. I mean, you know, my career is based on the fact that I responded to an ad that the New Yorker had reprinted from Columbia University. They had written, this is fall of 2001. I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I had, you know, after 9/11, I, you know, total cliche, packed the bag of GMAT folks, LSAT folks, whatever. Went to Israel for a couple of weeks. And then at some point my parents were like, okay, that's enough. That it's time to try to be a little bit of an adult, which I think I'm probably still trying to do. But I was reading the New Yorker and there was an article, you know, Talk of the Town, kind of that tongue in cheek section. There was an article about how President Clinton's office had put out, and his office in Harlem had just opened. They put out an ad to the Columbia Poli-Sci Department looking for interns. Clinton looking for interns. Like, you know, think back to that time period.
Yeah.
But they reprinted the ad. I sent in a resume to that reprint of the ad. And that's how I ended up in the president's office. And my whole career is based on that, like momentarily like, hey, what the hell? Doesn't cost me a stamp to send this thing in. And basically every opportunity since then is sort of this, like, it's all built on that, but it's also just getting out there and like figuring it out, right? Like, you know, going back to kind of the internet dating thing, I don't even know how that would have worked. Like, friends set me up, but they're kind of putting pieces together. But if it's an algorithm that's putting you together, like serendipity is, it's the wandering is the serendipity. Like, think how many good ideas you have in the shower, right? Like, I used to keep a wax pencil in the shower to jot them down on the tile because I would never remember them afterward. What's his name? Chris Hayes, right? From MSNBC. He has a book out now about attention and kind of, you know, this whole argument about like, the current age is we're in a situation where like it's a fight for your attention. That's where it's always about. But you know, I love leaving my phone home and going for a 20-minute walk or going to the gym without my phone, not even a podcast, nothing. Just like, let's clear stuff out. Again, you know, being Sabbath observant, like has been a lifesaver in some ways because it is that time to get out of it, spend time with the family, spend time with friends, totally uninhibited by like the thing in my phone in pockets buzzing me, or I've got this work thing that I have to worry about. Like, sure, there are things and like, you know, after like a 2-day holiday or a 3-day holiday, like that last hour is some of the most stressful of my life because I know I'm walking into a buzzsaw and there's nothing I can do about it.
All right, we're going to play the game. We're going to see. Eric, I'm gonna get you to go first. Can you guess why I wanted to get you and Elie Jacobs here together for this conversation?
Well, I guess the fairly obvious reason would be, you know, it sounds like Elie works a lot with journalists and companies to kind of figure out what their story is. And I really started my career and still try to do that as an investor, really try to figure out like what the story is and pursue truth through that lens. Is that right?
Oh, I think we're on to something here. Elie, what about you? You want to take a stab at
I
it?
just thought it's because we both have beards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean,
AI generated beards.
to go a whole lot deeper, and Matt, you obviously didn't know this, but my 3-year-old was born with cranial synostosis. So she had to have her skull reconstructive surgery when she was 3 months old, and she still has a little hole in her head. It's slowly closing, but she has a hole in her head. So again, probably a reason you didn't realize serendipity though.
Absolutely.
So I wrote down the stories we tell, the stories we're told, and basically how to make the most of them, which I think is about as serendipity as you get, because I know whether you're studying that as a journalist, Eric, from the seat that you used to sit in, or now on the investor side of going, basically, are they bullshitting me? And then what's the risk to the upside and the downside inside of the story with my expectations? And then Elie, you stepping in too, when something has gone wrong, helping somebody not just either get it back on track or build it from the ground up. There are a few professionals I run into that are this aware of story and how to strategically deploy it. And that was really what I was hoping we'd sort of start to scratch the surface on. I think we succeeded. So
Yeah.
Elie Jacobs, if people want to get you in their network, they want to find you online, where should they look you up when you're not throwing your phone into the East River and picking up a
So LinkedIn is always a great place to find me, or you can go to our corporate website, which is purposeful ADV. That's Apple David Victor .com. It's not a particularly fancy website. There's not a ton of information on it. That's kind of on purpose. And I'm not very prolific on any other social media at this point.
Fantastic. Definitely go connect with him on LinkedIn. And Eric Markowitz, if the people want to find more, where's the best places to go? You're everywhere these days. What do you got?
Yeah. Well, I think I read a weekly newsletter. It's called The Nightcrawler. And it's just every Friday I send out a few articles or podcasts that I've been listening to that I think are worth listening to or reading. And you can sign up on our website, 92capital.com, or just go to my Twitter account, Eric Markowitz.
Fantastic. I want to thank you both for taking the risk, coming on here, having this conversation with me. I am certain in our Skynet future, you're both my John Connors. So thank you very much for your service. Just press record, like, subscribe, all the things below, and we are out. Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below to Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Zeigler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.